I'm Rob Skinner, and this is the Rob Skinner Podcast. Today, I'm continuing my exposition of Matthew in Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 21. All this and more on the Rob Skinner Podcast. Welcome back to the Rob Skinner Podcast. My goal is to inspire you to live a no-regrets life, make this life count, and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. It is August 1st, 2024, and I am excited because next week I am going to take a little vacation and go visit my family up in Oregon, and we're going to stay for a week on Lake of the Woods, Oregon, which is in between Ashland, Oregon, and Klamath Falls. It's one of my favorite places, place that I took the kids when they were young, when we used to live in Oregon, and it's definitely one of my happy places, so I can't wait to go and looking forward to it. So thrilled about this week, what God is doing in terms of Bible studies. Just sense there's something really special going to happen this fall. So God is working. It's been a great summer, and I believe the fall is going to be amazing as well. Thank you so much for listening to the Rob Skinner Podcast. I appreciate your support. I appreciate everyone who does listen. I look at the statistics. I see who's listening and, the countries, and it's amazing to think I've got people listening in, Papua New Guinea. I've got people listening in Australia. I've got people listening in Japan or in Bulgaria. It's crazy. It's amazing. I'm so honored that you take your time to listen. And if you feel like you're benefiting from the program, I'd like to ask you to support it with a gift, because your support enables me to multiply disciples, leaders, and churches and inspire others to do the same through this podcast. I mentioned before, but I took a recent trip to scout a mission planting area in Stockton, California, which is in the Central Valley of California. I was able to do that because of support from listeners like yourself. And it just makes a massive, massive difference. So all you need to do is go to the show notes, and there's a link to support the program. Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 21. This section connects to and highlights what Jesus meant when he said in Matthew 11, 28 through 30, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus offers rest, which is the express purpose of the Sabbath. He says his yoke is easy and his burden is light. This is in contrast to the legalism of the Pharisees. They had developed 39 laws that explained what you couldn't do on a day of rest. 39 categories of activity that could be classified as work. They claimed to put up a fence around the law so you would be careful not to break the law. Now here are just 20 of the 39 categories of work that were prohibited on the Sabbath: carrying, burning, extinguishing, finishing, writing, erasing, cooking, washing, sewing, tearing, knotting, untying, shaping, plowing, planting, reaping, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, and selecting. Okay, that's just 20. And each one of those is a category. So you've got subcategories underneath each one of those headings. And so Jesus addresses these by appealing to his inherent authority and the priority of the spirit of the law over the letter of the law. So first point, Jesus, Lord of the Sabbath. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So Jesus had offered rest in the previous chapter, which was the purpose of the Sabbath, when he said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest." And he said, "I'm gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The Pharisees, on the other hand, made Sabbath keeping a chore. For example, you couldn't spit on the Sabbath because it would disturb the dirt and you'd be guilty of plowing because of it. Okay, I don't know how that came about, but that's crazy. You could not swat a fly on the Sabbath because you'd be guilty of hunting. A woman could not look at a reflection because she might see a gray hair and pluck it out, which would be doing work. Now, they did create loopholes to get around some of the laws that they created. If your house was burning down on a Sabbath, you could not carry clothes out of it. However, you were allowed to put on several layers of clothes as the house was burning down. You could leave without breaking the law because you were wearing them instead of carrying them. Okay, so if you can keep track of that, your house, just imagine that your house is on fire and you're like, "Ooh, I can't carry these clothes out. I'm going to have to just put them on. I have to dress myself as the fire's burning down the house." Okay, just absolutely ludicrous. In chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, they're picking grain. Picking grain could fall under the category of reaping, while getting the grain out of the husks could be considered threshing, both of which were prohibited by the Pharisees. Now keep in mind that this is happening on a Saturday, the Sabbath. It must have been close enough to town to not break the distance rule of about a half mile of walking allowed. So the Pharisees were circling Jesus and his disciples, looking for any breaking of their laws. So they're close to town, and they are just monitoring Jesus. They're just looking for some infraction that they can call him on. Jesus argues against the Pharisees using 3 levels of authority that he carries because of who he is as God. First, Jesus is greater than King David. Then he says he's greater than the temple. And finally, Jesus is greater than the law or the Old Testament writings. So 3 levels of authority that he claims because of his inherent identity as the Son of God. In verse 3 through 4, Jesus asks, "Haven't you read such and such?" Now, this was a subtle, not too subtle dig to the Pharisees who prided themselves on their knowledge and memorization of Scripture. He points out that David, their hero and king, broke their law by eating bread only allowed to the priests. It was his authority as king that superseded the law. Jesus is saying, how much more is it lawful for the king of the world to supersede any regulation? Not only that, they were both hungry. He's not saying that because the law was broken once, it could be broken again, but it does matter who's doing the breaking of the law. Then in verse 5 through 6, Jesus builds on this theme of authority when he talks about how the priests, quote unquote, work on the Sabbath in doing their normal duties at the temple. Then he says something shocking. He says, something greater than the temple is here. To the Jew, what could be greater than the temple? This was the house of God. This is where God lived. The temple was the focus of Israel's worship, its national center, the destination for all pilgrimages, and the essence of its national identity. Jesus is saying that he himself is the center of all future worship. This is what got Jesus killed. His cleansing of the temple, his claim that he'd rebuild the temple in 3 days, was really the final straw that confirmed in the Jews' mind that Jesus deserved death. Jesus was saying that in serving him and eating while working for him, his disciples were serving the greater presence and residence of God, which is Jesus himself. He's greater than the temple. They were exempt from these lesser regulations. Jesus and the church he started were greater than the temple. His role as mediator, prophet, priest, and king is greater than the temple of Moses' time. That's one of the significances of the temple curtain being torn when Jesus died. He says that time period is over, got a new time period. Jesus is the temple of God. So in verse 7, Jesus again points out his operating theology when he draws from Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. Love matters more than ritual or rules. It's always better to err on the side of love over laws. He also highlights the error of their human traditions that led them to condemn people who were innocent in the sight of God. In chapter 12, verse 8, Jesus drives a sword even deeper in calling himself the Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a defining feature of the Jewish religion. They and a few other groups are known as Sabbath keepers. The Sabbath originates all the way back when God rested on the seventh day, Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. We're talking way, way old, lots of history. And it was instituted in the Ten Commandments. In Exodus 31, verse 13, God calls it my Sabbath. It's his. As the creator of the world and author of the law, Jesus had unique authority to interpret it as he chose. For Jesus to say, I'm Lord of the Sabbath, was heresy in the ears of the Pharisees. He was saying, I, not you, know how to interpret the Sabbath law and its application. Why? Because I wrote the law. You didn't. This was a direct attack on the Pharisees' religious authority, and it's what made them so mad. Point number 2, the healing of a man with a shriveled hand. Going on from that place, in verse 9, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. In verse 11 through 12, Jesus appeals to common sense that the average person would understand completely when he says, hey, if any of you has a sheep, ... Jesus again stresses how much more valuable people are than animals. Now, this is not popular these days when there's so many animal rights activists and, basically saying animals are equal to or more important than people. But Jesus is very clear. People are way more valuable than animals. He also points out the inconsistency of the Pharisees' own teaching. They would do work if it meant preserving their own property. Jesus' interpretation puts responsibility on each one of us to figure out what is good or positive to do in interpreting any action. The Pharisees had a fundamentally negative focus on what couldn't be done. Jesus points to a higher method of asking yourself, how can I do good in this current situation? That's a much better way and much more positive way to approach life. How can I do good in this situation? How can I serve people? How can I make the biggest difference? In verse 13 through 14 of chapter 12, Jesus goes on to heal the man's hand publicly. It was a public embarrassment and shaming of the Jews. He embarrassed them in their synagogue, chapter 12, verse 9. Okay, so Jesus he's on their turf. He's in their synagogue. He beat them on their own home field. Their authority was damaged. Their motives got exposed, and their hatred was inflamed. The Jews wanted to kill Jesus. Jesus said it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Now think about this. The Pharisees wanted to kill on the Sabbath. Okay, I mean, you couldn't get more diametrically opposite than these two. Here's the people so determined to do what's right on the Sabbath, and they are willing at this point, we want to kill Jesus on the Sabbath. Apparently they weren't thinking straight at that point. There's something I really love. I know I get stuck on YouTube videos sometimes. One thing I really like is these turtle videos. And people on fishing boats, they catch turtles that are caught up in fishing nets, and then they cut them loose, and then they set them free. And it always brings kind of a little tear to your eye. And there's one video I showed recently at church, and showed a turtle that was flipped up on his back, a big turtle. And the people come along, they flip it right side up, and then they push it into the surf, and it gets out safely. It's a touching video. It got viewed over 2 million times. But you need to think how much more powerful when we can help people turn their upside down lives right side up. That's what really gets Jesus fired up. I mean, he loves the animals. He loves everything that he's created. But what should really get us motivated is helping people get their lives turned around. That is really the most important thing. And when you're studying the Bible with people and you're really teaching them the gospel, it is so satisfying. That's why it's my mission in life to multiply disciples, leaders, and churches, because I go, there's nothing more meaningful than helping people to develop a relationship with Christ. God's servant. Point number 3, God's servant. Aware of this, in verse 15, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope. In verse 15 through 16, Jesus is getting threatened. His life is getting threatened. He's getting attacked. People are going after him. But what does he do? He doesn't go on the attack. He withdraws. He puts into practice what he taught his disciples in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 14 and 10:23. When people don't accept your teaching, shake the dust off and go somewhere else. Be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Jesus just leaves. Now, he could have laid them low. He could have done anything he wanted to, but he just leaves and he continues his work of preaching and healing. Why does he do this? Why doesn't he have a massive showdown with the Pharisees right then and there? He's clearly in the right. Well, it gets revealed in verses 18 through 21 as just another fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah's character and method. In verse 18 through 21, Jesus again defines himself by what he doesn't do. Unlike John and others' expectations, John the Baptist and others' expectations that he would judge, condemn, blow away, destroy Roman rule, Jesus reveals himself as gentle and lowly or humble. He will not quarrel. He doesn't get into a fight, shouting match with these people. He doesn't cry out. He touts a more non-confrontational manner, an avoidance of publicity, and a patient, encouraging type of ministry. He won't argue with the Pharisees. He won't shout at them or deliberately embarrass them. Bruised reeds and smoldering wicks. A reed was used as a light walking stick, a musical instrument, or a way to measure things. But once it was bruised, it was typically discarded. A smoldering wick was made of linen, and if it smoked, would fill the whole house with smoke. It too was immediately replaced. The ministry of the Messiah is one in which he won't break the reed or snuff out the wick. Jesus is patient and kind with people who are bruised and whose fire has dimmed. He's patient with the Pharisees who are deeply damaged, and he's incredibly patient with people who have experienced trauma, trouble, difficulty, and trials. Think about the bleeding woman. Think about the man with the shriveled hand. Think about the lepers. These were all bruised reeds that Jesus wouldn't discard. He would just heal them. Now, you might be a bruised reed. Maybe life has bruised you. You've taken your hits. Guess what? Jesus is loving and patient with you. He won't break you. He won't say, I'm done with you. He's patient, gentle, and lowly, and he's willing to work with all of us in our bruised and battered condition. All he asks is that you come to him. Look to him for healing. Don't count yourself out. Stop tearing yourself down. Go to Jesus. Or you might be a smoldering wick. What do I mean by that? Maybe your spiritual fire was higher in the past. Maybe you used to light up the room when you walked into church, your home, your classroom, or your workplace. Now all you can muster is a barely burning flame and lots of smoke. People know when you're coming and when you're around. You're not what you once were. Guess what? Jesus won't snuff you out. Isn't that good news? He's willing to work with you and help you get your fire going again. All you have to do is go to him and work with him. Don't quit on him. Ask for help. Jesus offers rest and a light burden for all bruised reeds and smoldering wicks. There was a time in my life as a young Christian I almost walked away from God. I was struggling with pride, with impurity. I was discouraged. I had a motivation issue. There was a lot that was driving me that was not godly. And Jesus was really patient with me. And luckily the people in the church were patient too. I just was not peaking out. I had a good start, but I really, really stumbled and struggled and almost walked away from church. But I just got into the Bible. I started reading it more seriously. I found some passages in the New Testament that really centered around Jesus and his love for me. And I realized, you know what? I'm a smoldering wick right now. I'm not burning as brightly as I once was. But Jesus will not give up on me. And I want to tell you that if you're feeling down, if you're feeling discouraged, if you feel like you've taken your hits, he will not let you go. Thanks for listening. Here's how you can help support the program. First, let your friends know about it. Secondly, read and review one of my books, either How to Plant and Grow a Church or Courage, How to Make This Life Count. You can find both of them on Amazon.com, either paperback or you can buy it electronically. Finally, just support the program with a gift today. The link is in the show notes because my goal is to inspire you to make this life count, live a no regrets life, and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. Have a great day and make this life count.